Welcome to the Monty Collier Report. I'm Monty Collier. Recently, Federal Vision proponent R.C. Sproul Jr. contacted me by email. He asked me if I could show him where he has taught the Catholic position of justification by faith and works. You see, he has recently been trying to convince people that he doesn't teach justification by faith and works. I said, sure, no problem. I asked R.C. if he would like to come onto the show while I demonstrated to everybody his Catholic position concerning faith and works, but sadly he declined. Nevertheless, this video will demonstrate from R.C.'s own writing that he believes man is justified by faith and works. The article that I'll be using is posted and can be found on R.C.'s Highland Study Center website. I have provided a link to the article to the right of the screen in the video description box. I also have the entire article posted in the box for you to read. The article is titled, "Do Paul and James Contradict on Justification?" The article begins with someone asking R.C. the following, and I quote, "I have always been a bit puzzled by the conflict between Paul's justification by faith alone and justification by works, mentioned in the book of James. Do you think these guys actually disagree about what it took to be saved? Can you shed some light on this subject?" End quote. Well, R.C. writes a total of 5 paragraphs in response to this question. At the end of the first paragraph, R.C. writes, and I quote, "James and Paul do not contradict, but speak in harmony, though they speak to different questions." End quote. Then, in the third paragraph, this serious trouble begins. R.C. writes, and I quote, "James is answering a different question. Paul affirms that faith brings us the work of Christ, which brings us peace with the Father. James asks and answers, what kind of faith does this?" End quote. Now, the book of James does not answer the question, what kind of faith justifies us before God? This is completely wrong. James is explaining how one man may demonstrate to another man that he is a Christian. James is not explaining what kind of faith justifies before God. By asking the wrong question, R.C. has set the stage to teach justification by faith and works. R.C. continues, and I quote, "Faith is more than believing something is true." End quote. Well, this ought to get your attention, for Catholics love to teach that faith is not just belief, but also works. Let's just see if R.C. is going to add works to the definition of faith. Like a good little Catholic. R.C. continues, and I quote, "A living faith is a trusting faith." End quote. Well, this is not an explanation. It's not a definition. We now have to ask what R.C. means by trusting faith. R.C. continues, and I quote, "A trusting faith shows itself to be a trusting faith, James affirms, by bearing fruit." End quote. Oh, so now trusting faith has been replaced with bearing fruit. Now we have to find out what R.C. means by bearing fruit. Keep in mind, this is supposed to be a simple explanation, although we've yet to get to any. R.C. continues, and I quote, "Those who do trust in Christ alone will in fact grow in grace." End quote. Now, bearing fruit has been replaced with growing grace. R.C. has yet to give us a definition. He is switching from one metaphor to another. We now have to find out what he means by growing in grace in order to understand what he means by faith. So R.C. continues, and I quote, "They will become more obedient to the law of God." End quote. Ah, obedience. Now, obedience means good works. So R.C., though he took his time, finally got around to defining faith as not just belief in the truth, not just belief in the gospel, but also good works or obedience. This is the Catholic teaching of justification by faith and works. So now remember, according to R.C. Sproul Jr., believing the gospel is not enough. You have to have good works too. It's faith and works. That's the kind of faith that justifies before God, according to R.C. Sproul Jr., proponent of Federal Vision. This is heresy. It's not the truth. James doesn't teach what kind of faith justifies us before God. James teaches how one Christian can demonstrate to another that he actually believes the gospel. Big difference. R.C. Sproul Jr. has confused the law and the gospel. He has mixed sanctification with justification. By doing so, he has destroyed the gospel. It is Paul that teaches what kind of faith justifies us before God. It's faith alone, faith without works. Well, R.C. Sproul Jr. tries to immediately disguise the doctrine that he just taught from the unlearned person when he writes, and I quote, "This obedience or works do not make God deem us to be just, but they do justify the notion that we have faith," end quote. Here R.C. is simply stating that obedience doesn't justify us before God, and no Catholic would disagree, for Catholics teach that it is faith and obedience that justifies before God, just what R.C. got done teaching. Calvinists maintain that it is faith without obedience, faith without works, that is, faith alone that justifies us before God. R.C. tries to end his little article by trying to sound reformed. He writes, and I quote, "It is faith and faith alone that appropriates the work of Christ," end quote. However, since R.C. defines faith to be believing the gospel and doing good works, then it is clear that R.C. means something entirely different than Martin Luther and John Calvin. They defined the doctrine of faith alone to be only believing the gospel, apart from any good works, apart from any of our own obedience. R.C. Sproul Jr. has clearly contradicted Romans chapter 3, verse 28, which teaches, and I quote, "Therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith without the deeds of the law," end quote.